This is an event sponsored by the London Centre for Policy Research. I'm Herb London. One of the reasons why we're here is because we have the opportunity to speak to a truly extraordinary man who I'll describe in just a moment. But I want to tell you a little bit about our activities. The London Centre is very much interested in the whole question of hotspots around the globe, how we think about them, how we plan, and our principal interest at the moment is in Egypt, where we're spending a lot of time, and Tony Schaefer, who has been our representative in Egypt, has gone, and some of you actually heard him speak the last time we were at the Union League Club. In addition to what we're doing in Egypt, we have been conducting regular meetings on the Hill. Ellie Gold, Vice President of the organization, has been working with the Congress on trying to put together various coalitions to deal with the agenda that we consider appropriate. And then on top of that, we have a very special event on the 24th. I urge you to come. One of this country's most brilliant actors is going to do a performance of The Little Flower. The Little Flower is the story of Mayor LaGuardia. He actually transforms himself into Mayor LaGuardia. And Tony is with us tonight. Tony LaBianco is going to do this play on the 24th at the Da Capo Theater, 76th Street, Lexington Avenue. Please come. Bring your friends, because this is special. Really, it's very special. Tony's performance is brilliant. And of course, those of you who have seen Tony in TV programs like Law and Order and films like The French Connection are well aware of his acting talents. But when you see this production, you will be transformed. You will feel as though you're in the presence of LaGuardia. And considering who we have for mayor at the moment, I would very much like to see him. But that's another issue. I don't want to get too deeply into politics at the moment. But it is important, I think, for you to join us. All of the proceeds of this event, due to Tony's extraordinary generosity, will be given to the London Centre. So join us if you can. We would very much like to have you there. It is a very special evening, truly quite special. Now, the last matter I wanted to bring to your attention is the introduction of my dear friend, Michael Mukasey. Now, it's very difficult for me to introduce a friend and someone I admire at the same time, but on this occasion, I can do so because in my lifetime, I've known two brilliant jurists. One is Robert Bork, unfortunately left us last year, who in my judgment was a truly brilliant jurist. When he brought cases to the Supreme Court as a Solicitor General, he never lost a case, never lost a case. Michael Mukasey is in the same realm of being a brilliant jurist. But more than brilliant, a commonsensical jurist, someone who understands what our Constitution is all about at a time when people have become very cavalier, almost capricious with the meaning of the Constitution. And so it is an honor for me to introduce Michael Mukasey, the former Attorney General of the United States, appointed to the Southern District by Ronald Reagan, and someone who is now with a law firm in New York. I also would be very remiss if I didn't introduce two of my favorite people who are in the audience tonight. Norman Podhoretz, who I regard as one of the great figures in American life, not only because he was an editor at Commentary Magazine, but because of the extraordinary courage that he displays every time he writes an article, and his dear wife, Mitch Decter, who I also regard as one of the great figures in American cultural life. So thank you for being here tonight, and Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much, Herb, for that very kind introduction and to the London Centre for inviting me here. I can't imagine a podium that I value more. Although I have to say that I could have wished for a better reference line on the subject line, rather, on the email that invited people to this function. The subject line is Washington Lawlessness with Michael Mukasey. I'm surprised we drew such a respectable crowd in view of that reference line. At the risk of giving offense, I'm going to argue a bit with some of what was actually printed in the invitation on the program, not because I don't think we are, in fact, confronted with lawlessness of a truly historic and maybe even unprecedented scale, but rather because I think that in order to confront it, we have to keep our priorities in order. Because other than a compliant press, I think the administration's key to success seems to be doing so many things outside the law that it becomes difficult to maintain public focus on any one of them. I'm not saying that that's necessarily intentionally their strategy, but it does seem to work out that way. If you read the invitation, you were told that I was going to discuss, quote, the lawlessness of the Obama administration from the IRS to the NSA to Benghazi to Fast and Furious to overriding immigration law, and that I will then talk about, again in the words of the invitation, how we can stop an out-of-control administration that ignores our laws. Should recourse be had to suing to stop that kind of activity? Are impeachment and elections our only recourse? What role can the Supreme Court play? And you'll notice Obamacare didn't even make the list. How many hours do you have? Seriously, what I want to stress is the importance of a maxim that I think was coined by the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, who said that the first rule of morality is to think clearly. And since a lot of what's been going on, whether illegal or not, is certainly immoral, let's at least honor morality by thinking clearly. Let's start with the list. The IRS, the NSA, Benghazi, Fast and Furious. One of the items on that list doesn't really belong, in my view, and that's NSA. The scandal there is not what the NSA was doing to protect the safety and security of this country, which was and is entirely perfectly lawful and constitutional. It is rather how a contractor was able to make off with about 1.5 million documents, some of which contain the kind of information that allow our enemies to frustrate our defenses. That is the scandal. And just to close the parenthesis around this part of the discussion, the criticisms of the NSA that have been made thus far involve two programs, one of which involves gathering what we call metadata on all domestic calls, that is the calling number, the number called, the date and length of the call, neither the identity of the person who makes or receives any of the call, nor any of the content of the call is in this database. Rather, the information is gathered so that if we learn the telephone number of a foreign terrorist or a safe house the terrorists use, we can check to see whether that number has called a number in the United States or been called by a number in the United States, and then perhaps get a warrant from a court using the same rules that apply to any other wiretap to listen in on the calls at the U.S. number that made the call or received it. The other program involves electronic surveillance of non-U.S. persons abroad, foreign governments and others. It includes surveillance of telephone calls, emails, other electronic communication, so that we can gather information to protect this country's security and to protect its other foreign interests. This is something that all governments do. It's something foreign governments do here. That's why when I was Attorney General, I was not permitted to have a personal electronic device like a BlackBerry, and why such devices, whether personal or government issued, have to be surrendered before people attend meetings in places like the Situation Room at the White House, because they're afraid of foreign eavesdropping. Everybody does it. And if we stopped such surveillance tomorrow, we would be the only country in the world that did, and we would suffer for it. That's the reality. And of course, the one that didn't make the list was Obamacare, and the various adjustments and postponements of deadlines that have been effected so far. Most recently, actually in my favorite, because of a requirement that was imposed with it, is the postponement of the employer mandate for businesses between 50 and 99 employees, which was supposed to be required to provide federally approved insurance. That requirement has now been put off until 2016. Now, everybody with a pulse knows that that was done in order to avoid the effect of imposing that requirement before the elections in 2014 and having blowback because of the requirement. There's no authority in the law for postponing the requirement. The law says shall at the point where the requirement is imposed. It doesn't say may. There's no authority anywhere that permits a president or anyone else to decide that part of the law will be enforced and part will not. But that is actually not the most indefensible part of what was done here. That distinction is reserved for an additional requirement that was imposed on businesses of between 50 and 99 employees. They have to certify to the IRS, and I'll get to the IRS in a minute, but they have to certify that they did not make any hiring or firing decisions in order to get or stay below 100 employees and get the benefit of this postponement. And that certification is under oath, with the penalty being presumably the penalty that applies to making a false statement to any government agency. In other words, and this I owe to Chris Stirewalt of Fox News, he said, in order to avoid Obamacare costs, you have to swear that you're not trying to avoid Obamacare costs. And if you swear falsely, you can be prosecuted for making a false statement to the government. So an entirely new crime is brought into existence to accompany the crime that was already committed by an illegal change in the law. And if you think about it for a minute, if somebody running a business of around 100 employees decides that he doesn't want to file a false certification, and he pays no attention to the cost that business may be incurring, then he is violating his fiduciary duty to the corporation, to the shareholders, and he should be removed by the board and drummed out by the shareholders, or sued by the shareholders. He's supposed to pay attention to those costs. That's what businesses are there for, to make money. That's why we have a capitalist system. This exquisite feature of Obamacare actually takes us back to the list that the flyer advertising this event that was on the list advertising the event, and specifically to the IRS, because although you may have heard that the Congressional Budget Office predicted lower employment as a result of Obamacare, employment at the IRS actually will go up because the law increases, although the law increases demand for medical services without increasing the supply of doctors, it does increase the supply of IRS agents because they're going to be in charge of enforcing the law. But what about the IRS? There really is and has been a series of scandals involving lawlessness of the IRS, but that should actually not come as a huge surprise. The IRS has had a long and not entirely honorable history of politically motivated action. Some of you may recall that when the steel producers tried to raise prices during the Kennedy administration, they were met with a flurry of IRS subpoenas and threats and backed down. Yet even by that standard, the goings-on at the IRS have been remarkable. We've heard about the targeting of conservative groups filing for exemptions under Section 501c4 for intensive examination so that they could not get the tax exemption to which they were in fact entitled in time to have an effect on the issues that dominated the 2012 election. That's not the only scandal. It appears that information about the identity of donors to conservative tax-exempt groups has been disclosed to liberal groups like ProPublica, which regularly leak such information. And even the majority leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, went so far as to boast, falsely as it turned out, that he knew that Mitt Romney paid no taxes. And Austin Goolsbee, who was a former high administration official, also boasted, again, apparently without justification, that he knew that the Koch brothers were stiffing the IRS. Now, when senior government officials are willing to play on the credibility of the populace for the proposition that they can get access to taxpayer information, then it's time to ask a question about whether something ought to be done. Now, I'm going to skip past Benghazi for a moment. We'll come back to that in a bit, because I think it's far and away the most serious of the matters that were on this list. But first, let's deal with Fast and Furious, which was serious but easily summarized. As it happens, it does not appear to involve illegality, at least not in the first instance. It doesn't involve illegality so much as it does really bad judgment. What seems to have happened is that the administration hit on an idea that was supposed to generate support for gun regulation. They would have licensed gun dealers near the border sell weapons to what were obviously sham purchasers who were buying the guns for resale to drug dealers. The idea was to let those purchasers buy the weapons and then follow them until they delivered the weapons to others, and then close in and make arrests. And that would, of course, generate publicity that those guns had come from gun dealers near the border and would generate enthusiasm for gun regulation. Now understand that there is a recognized and frequently used law enforcement stratagem called a controlled delivery, which usually involves intercepting some contraband, whether it's drugs or counterfeit money or weapons, and then substituting either another substance for the drugs or another courier, or getting the designated courier to cooperate, and then delivering the package to the target defendant for whom it's intended, with law enforcement agents on the scene who make an arrest immediately as soon as the delivery is made. The constant presence of law enforcement agents when the delivery is made is why they call it a controlled delivery. The guiding principle is that law enforcement authorities never allow the contraband to get out of sight or control. Otherwise, it's not a controlled delivery. You never let the drugs get to the point where they wind up getting into the street, or let the counterfeit money get into circulation, or you certainly never lose sight of the guns, because that way they fall into the hands of criminals. The strategy employed in the Fast and Furious operation wasn't a controlled delivery. It was simply a harebrained scheme designed to make it seem that gun dealers near the border were the source for illegal weapons going to Mexico, so that those dealers could be regulated more closely, and others as well. But the geniuses simply let the guns walk out of control of law enforcement agents, with the result that they were sold to drug dealers, and one of them wound up being used to kill a border agent. The question that then arose was how high up in the administration of the Justice Department was the knowledge that this tactic was being used before that agent was killed. The Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division swore that he did not know, and the Attorney General swore that he did not know. The Inspector General of the Justice Department investigated, and that, by the way, that IG is one of the honest ones, and did not find enough evidence to contradict that testimony. However, that said, it's clear that the Attorney General did testify falsely when he tried to suggest that a similar operation had taken place under the Bush administration. That was a bit of perjury that I happen to know about because it involved testimony about me. However, other than lying after the fact, it doesn't appear that there was any actual criminality in connection with Fast and Furious. Stupidity, as it happens, is not a crime. If it were, we wouldn't be able to build the jails fast enough. Nor is conducting a law enforcement operation with an improper motive, in this case to generate support for gun regulation. But that's not to say that those involved do not deserve criticism of the underlying operation. They certainly do. And that brings us to Benghazi. And here the story turns a lot darker. You'll recall that on September 11, 2012, the 11th anniversary of the 9/11 attack, Ambassador Chris Stevens and two CIA employees, Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, both former Navy SEALs, along with Sean Smith, a computer expert, were killed in an attack that the administration maintained was motivated by a video produced in the United States and sent out over the internet by a parolee named Nakula Baselli Nakula that made fun of the Prophet Muhammad. I want to take you briefly through a timeline that summarizes those events, not because doing that will allow you to understand fully what happened, because it won't. There's too much information missing, but rather because it will help you understand why it's important to find out. Now, there may be 40 or 50 separate events in this timeline, but the relevant time periods divide up easily into segments that get shorter and shorter as you approach September 11, and that then longer and longer as you get away from it. The first segment is March through June of 2012. What's going on in Benghazi at that time? What's going on is that terrorists are throwing an IED over the wall of the U.S. consulate, later blowing a hole in the consulate gate, attacking the Red Cross and warning the United States of further attacks, and attempting to assassinate the British ambassador, who survives. Al-Qaeda forces stage an open rally in Benghazi. And in Washington, what's going on during that period? 4 separate communications from diplomats in Libya requesting additional security, topped off by a cable on June 22nd from Ambassador Stevens, warning that terrorist groups were operating openly in Benghazi. That was the open rally of Al-Qaeda, and in Libya as a whole. And 4 separate occasions when the State Department refuses to provide additional security. The events in July begin with the State Department bureaucrat telling the diplomats in Libya not to make a formal request to extend the presence of security teams, because that request will be turned down. That's followed by 4 requests that are submitted nonetheless for additional security, including one from the ambassador and one from the regional security officer, both addressed to the Secretary of State's office. None gets a positive response. And then we get to September, and September 11 itself. On September 8, a Libyan security official warns the United States of impending attacks. On September 10, the new Al-Qaeda leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, calls on Libyans to avenge the death of his deputy, Abu Yahya al-Libi, whose name, ending with the words al-Libi, makes it clear that he was a Libyan. September 11, Ambassador Stevens sends a cable warning of deteriorating security in Benghazi, and then meets with a Turkish diplomat. During the meeting, terrorists were apparently setting up checkpoints around the embassy. The meeting ends, the Turkish diplomat leaves, and the first shots are heard. The ambassador calls his deputy in Tripoli, Gregory Hicks, and tells him we're under attack. At near 4 p.m. Washington time, the Defense Department orders that an unarmed drone reposition over the mission in Benghazi. 6 minutes later, at 5 after 4, the State Department informs the White House and the Pentagon that the consulate is under attack. At about 5 p.m. in Washington time, the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary of Defense meet at the White House. By that time, the consulate has been abandoned, the ambassador is already missing, and probably dead. Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, despite being told to stand down, leave Tripoli for Benghazi with 5 others and arrive in Benghazi a couple of hours later. At this point, it's already September 12 in Benghazi. Shortly after 6 p.m. Washington time, a State Department email says that Ansar al-Sharia, an al-Qaeda affiliated organization, has taken credit for the attack. About 4 hours later, at about 10 p.m. on September 11, Secretary Clinton blames the internet video for the violence. At about that time, Doherty and Woods, who have taken up a position on the roof of the annex to the consulate, are hit by mortar shells that appear to have been targeted with a laser device and are killed. Sean Smith, the computer expert, is also killed. On September 12, shortly before 11 a.m., the President meets with Secretary Clinton at the State Department. Later that day, shortly before 7, the President arrives in Las Vegas for a fundraiser. He leaves for Colorado later that evening and delivers a campaign speech there. September 13, Press Secretary Jay Carney blames the internet video for the violence. The following day, September 14, he says there was no advance warning or pre-planning of the attack. The same day, a CNN reporter finds Ambassador Stevens' diary in the burned-out consulate. It contains on the last page the notation, quote, "never-ending security threats," and an ellipsis. September 15, as the coffins of the 4 victims are being carried off a plane at Andrews Air Force Base, and this to me was the greatest obscenity, both Secretary Clinton and the President blame the video for the violence and then stroll over to the families. And Secretary Clinton tells the Woods family that we're going to have the person who made that video arrested. September 16, Sunday, Susan Rice takes to the airwaves to blame the video for the violence. The same day, the President of Libya says that the attack was planned and was carried out by al-Qaeda. And of course, that we know up until today, although we know the identity of at least 3 of the likely perpetrators, one of whom has been giving interviews to the press, none of them has been arrested. In fact, the only person who has been arrested, true to the promise that Secretary Clinton made to the family of Tyrone Woods, is the parolee, Nakula Baseli Nakula, who produced the video. He was arrested in the middle of the night for a parole violation with more armament present than anybody was willing to send to Benghazi. Meanwhile, the survivors have been required to sign confidentiality statements and to take polygraph tests to make sure that they're complying with those statements. And of course, there's more. There's Secretary Clinton's famous, "What difference at this point does it make?" But you now understand the problem. What is it that can be done about all of this? The answers differ. My own view is that by far the most, as I said, by far the most serious of these abuses, and the one that I've devoted the most time to, is Benghazi. Because people were killed, because there was a political motive to obscure the reasons underlying the attack, that is, to conceal the fact that al-Qaeda was in fact functioning, contrary to the President's claim that it had been decimated. Because numerous misstatements were made both to Congress and to the public, and because it involves not only the current administration, which, let's face it, is going to be there for another 3 years regardless, but it also involves somebody who would like to head the next administration. What is it that could be done? There's no lawsuit to be filed here. Obviously, the leadership of the Senate is in the hands of the administration's party, and so there's no interest in pursuing the matter. Simple honesty, the welfare of the Republic not being sufficient motivation. The Republican leadership of the House of Representatives could authorize the creation of a select committee to conduct an investigation, rather than leaving it to a grab bag of committees that have overlapping jurisdiction. So why haven't they done that? They've been asked, and they stiff-armed those who've made the request. including me. My theory, and it's only a theory, is that they believe the public can concentrate on only one scandal at a time, and Obamacare is the more fruitful one, so they don't want to confuse the signals by directing attention at anything else. If that's true, it's clever. But there is, however, a difference between being clever and being intelligent. Obamacare does not fully occupy Congress and is not the subject of anything other than intermittent oversight hearings. There's no reason why a House Select Committee cannot work diligently and quietly and eventually report on what actually happened, or at least on who's refusing to disclose what actually happened. As to the IRS, that's largely a political scandal. You'll note that the Justice Department has given us the rather formulaic assurance that they're looking into it. Last I heard, the FBI conducted virtually no interviews. That's a tough nut to crack in this administration, given that the Attorney General, a close friend of the President, has made it clear that he will do nothing to embarrass the administration if he can help it, and he can help it. If too much time passes, a House committee could call back any witness who's invoked Fifth Amendment rights, immunize that witness, and then elicit the details. Of course, that would bring forth an objection that granting immunity messes up a future prosecution. But if it becomes clear that there isn't going to be a future prosecution, that's a pretty feeble response. As to overriding immigration laws by not deporting people who should be deported, that again is a political scandal to be answered in the political arena. As a general matter, this is to be handled in the arena where political scandals are handled, with the added caveat that any group that believes that it's being slow-walked by the IRS in getting a tax exemption can go to court, at least to compel the IRS to make a decision. Fast and Furious, in my view, as I said, is also a political scandal, although I think it would not hurt for the House Judiciary Committee to get hold of the list of the serial numbers of the weapons that were sold and then disappeared, and perhaps get cooperation from somebody in Mexico to see when they turn up at a Mexican crime scene and report each time they do. That would take some doing, but it's worth the effort. With respect to having such practices as, this was not on the list, it's having the EPA imposed by regulation rules that should, if they should be imposed at all, should be imposed by statute. I think the relevant power is the power of the purse, which would involve trying to cut the budget of the EPA and being prepared to respond to whatever negative comment that happens to elicit. As to the general question that was posed about what the role is of the courts and of the Supreme Court in particular, I think that we should remember that taking political disputes to court because you can't win them in the political arena is a tactic that's been practiced by people who are, by and large, on the other side of most of the debates that engage the attention of the people in this room. Many of us have been critical of that tactic for good reason. Understand that I can't say second to no one, I'm second only to several federal judges in my admiration for the federal judiciary. I used to be one. But I wouldn't want to entrust the courts with any disputes other than the ones that have to get there. Because if we can't rely on the American people, we can't rely on the courts. Thanks very much.
May I urge you, no speeches, please, just a question. Yes, please.
I'd like to ask you, sir, if say the Republican House cuts off funding to some part of Obama's favorite part of government, say the Department of Education or some favorite program, it seems to me that the president, unless all funding to the government is cut off, the president can shift funds around, and it becomes very hard to have that be effective. I'm wondering what you think.
It does. Obviously, there are some agencies where it's easier or where there's less damage likely than others. At the EPA, I'm sure that he will shift the funds around so that enforcement of anything that promotes the health and welfare of the country will be diminished. But again, the Republicans can point out that that's what he's doing. They have to obviously have a game plan going in. You don't simply slash and then wait for the reaction. You explain, you point out what can happen, and you anticipate it. And at some point, that will make it politically costly for him to do that. Yeah.
Yes, Lee.
Mr. Casey, that you're the first one that I've heard articulate, and I thought it when the president of Libya said it, and I don't understand why no one seized on the fact that the president of Libya himself declared what you said, that the Benghazi attack was pre-planned and Al-Qaeda related. What do you think of that?
I mean, if the fact that the Libyan president said that?
Yes, I mean, wouldn't that presumably let all the air out of the administration's argument?
There's enough air in that argument to last for a long time. Because understand that one of the instruments here is a compliant press. In order to have that fact grab public attention and be understood by the public, it has to be reported. It has to be reported widely and emphasized. And it's not reported widely and not emphasized. And there are no self-reporting facts.
It is interesting, of course, you didn't make reference to this, Michael, but the very interesting New York Times piece, which was ostensibly a cover-up by David Kirkpatrick, never mentioned the fact that there really was an Al-Qaeda flag flying in Benghazi, and that the president of Libya does point out that it was Al-Qaeda that was largely responsible for this action. And of course, the administration responds by suggesting, well, there's something called core Al-Qaeda, and this was not core Al-Qaeda. It was an affiliate of Al-Qaeda.
It depends what is.
I should point out that if you read that article, the one name you will not see mentioned in it at all, I don't mean only a few times, I mean not at all, is the name Clinton. Not once.
But John?
Yes. How much authority can the president delegate as to committing forces? Or is there some portion of this authority in a situation like Benghazi, like whether aircraft can cross a border or something like that, that he can't delegate? Or can he just say to Panetta, you have it all, call me in the morning?
Well, I don't know how this administration operates. I will tell you that, in my experience, presidents don't say, you've got all the authority, call me in the morning. I don't know about this one. A president obviously can authorize whatever he thinks is necessary to defend the country under his Article 2 power. He has the executive authority. It doesn't say some of the executive authority, it doesn't say all except a little bit, it says the executive authority shall be proposed to the president. That means all of it. And so he can do that.
Yes, Tony.
Regarding Benghazi, going back to this, it's pretty, from reporting recently, Mike Morrell, former assistant or acting CIA director, was the guy who put the actual bullet into the talking points paper that was used by Susan Rice regarding the video. It's very clear now from talking to members of both the media and the Hill that Morrell perjured himself as well as General Petraeus. It's very clear, unfortunately, your relief is not going to do anything about the fact that it looks like they purposely did this for purposes of deceit. What are Congress's options now when it's very clear that both those senior individuals essentially perjured themselves before Congress?
If they wanted to, they could call Morrell back and nail down all four corners good and hard. I mean, Morrell is a separate story. Somebody changed the water cooler outside his office and put it in Kool-Aid because he is drunk.
Oh, yeah.
Quite a lot of it. That's not the only instance. But yes, but Congress has to act. They want to find that somebody has perjured themselves. They can refer it for prosecution. True, they would have to refer it for prosecution to a U.S. attorney appointed by the president. But at least they can tee it up.
Tony?
When you mentioned that the lobbed the bomb or whatever it was over the fence, did not the Red Cross and the British Embassy leave?
Yes, the Red Cross pulled out, the Brits pulled out after they tried to assassinate their ambassador.
Right, but we stayed.
Right.
We stayed. Now, the other thing is, if we're not, and we're not, getting the news, except for one channel, and I guess they don't want people like yourself and others who believe like this room does on their channel, what about the idea of some very wealthy people buying ads on commercials on those channels and reporting the news, basically?
Problem is that, number one, I don't know whether that could be done, because the content of ads is something that the channels can regulate. But secondly, the effect of that, of course, is to put an enormous amount of money into the pockets of those channels. So, I mean,
But better than advertising what they advertise, and at least a way to get our message out and our news out.
it's a pretty desperate way. Fox has close to 50% of the viewership. That's quite a niche.
Yeah.
Let me ask a corollary question, and come back to what Tony is suggesting. You did point out that the Congress could establish a select committee, and presumably the select committee would have subpoena powers.
Yes.
But what stops the Congress from moving in this direction other than
The leadership.
political? It is the leadership.
Yes.
Because I still would very much like to do this, but it's
Yeah,
obviously
I-
not getting cooperation from Boehner.
Right.
Also, Congress-
Does it require both chambers?
No.
So it could be
Each
the House
chamber,
or committee?
yeah, each chamber can appoint its own select committees. Obviously, the Senate isn't going to appoint one. They're not interested in pursuing this. But the Republicans control the House, and they could.
Yes, Vivian.
Is there a sort of a timeframe on how long they would have to form this subcommittee?
No,
In other words, they can do it 2 years
Any
from
old
now.
time.
if they want.
any old time.
Is that-
Bill?
One angle missing from your timeline is the question, what was Stevens doing there at that time? How does that get filled out and some of the different theories incorporated into your...
I don't know, I mean, there are a number of theories that have already been offered about what Stevens was doing. I don't know that that is as important as the other questions that I did mention. I don't think whether Stevens was there for reasons that you or I might approve of or not, that he deserved to be killed in the way that he was, or in any way.
Some of the theories give further reason for why a cover-up of the video is useful.
Yeah, I don't think he had to resort to the video. No, I don't buy that. I don't buy that the video was a cover for Stevens' CIA-related mission in Benghazi. I don't see that at all. I don't see how that helps any more than telling the truth, which was that it was a terrorist attack.
Yes, please.
So I spent 8 years focused only on finding a solution to the cargo container problem so we could stop nuclear weapons from getting smuggled across the ports and the borders. And we won, we came number one when they tested all the technology, and George Bush signed into law in 2012 mandating that 100% of all cargo containers need to be checked by 2012, but they had a bit of a change of where the money was going to go, and they took, when the conservatives, or sorry, when the Liberals, I'm Canadian, got in, they basically took our very large contract away from us and said it was given to you by the Republicans, took all large contracts away, and basically now the money's being basically just taken right off the table and I guess put to Obamacare. So there isn't a lot of money right now to protect our cargo containers. So do you hear a lot about this, and do you think, as I do, that this is one of the biggest problems that we could face, really a nuclear attack in America, and the money's being transferred elsewhere, so there really isn't a lot of money to protect us?
I've not heard much lately about cargo containers, although I did hear a good bit about it several years ago.
It's just off the table, you know, with no protection.
Other questions? Arcadio?
With everything that you have said, when you have an administration that doesn't uphold the laws of, that they're supposed to, that the president has sworn, taken as an oath, I mean, there's always been the issue of executive orders and so forth, but this is almost to a totalitarian movement, and then the cover-up, and using all the other cabinet officers and others that are there, IRS and so forth and so on, the Justice Department, the Attorney General's office, to almost persecute other individuals that maybe criticize the present administration. Where do you see this going, and what options do we have to, with a media that is really co-conspirator with what's going on? What can we do to bring this to the surface?
Well, you keep
As citizens.
finding out about it and complaining about it. You make a noise.
One of the reasons why we exist.
That's probably what I'm doing here.
Yeah, that's why,
One voice.
that's why General Casey is invited, and that's one of the reasons why we continue to engage
There's a-
in our activity.
There's
Yes,
a
Carol,
microphone.
please.
Yes.
Is the man who created the video on which Benghazi was blamed by the administration, is he still in jail?
Yes.
And if so, what's his?
He was in jail for some cockamamie probation violation, I believe.
So it wasn't this violation, alleged violation?
Well, no, the video, free speech is still not, believe it or not, under violation. As of 4:07 on the 19th. But, no, it was some other way in which he violated us.
Violated the prohibition of going on the internet.
Was that it?
Yeah.
Norman?
You say something about Lois Lerner. Why haven't they called her back?
Well, that's the person who they could call back and immunize.
I know, well, why haven't they done that?
Because the
That
Justice...
sterilizes.
Yeah, the Justice Department is investigating the case, and their position would be, well, if you immunize Lois Lerner and she testifies, then we have the burden of showing that any evidence that we develop is developed independent of anything we find out from her public testimony. And if we can't do that, then no prosecution of Lois Lerner is possible. And you wouldn't want to do that, would you? Of course, there's going to be no prosecution of Lois Lerner. You know that, I know that, everybody in this room knows that. But when that becomes apparent, then I suppose they could bring her back and immunize her, if they are of a mind to do so.
Why can't they bring her back and recommend perjury? I mean, I've never understood how she got away with making a speech about how she was innocent and then taking the fifth. I mean, I remember the House Un-American Activities, but nobody was able to do that.
Well, they could force the issue and challenge her invocation of the Fifth Amendment right after making that statement, because there is such a thing as waiving your Fifth Amendment right, and one of the ways you waive it is by talking. They were not of a mind to be that bold. I don't know how far a judge would go in
How bold is it? I mean,
well,
it's
it's,
fairly obvious that she was not entitled to take the fifth.
I don't know that it's that obvious. I think that you would have to examine her statement very closely to see whether what she was doing was knowingly giving up a right to remain silent, and if so, as to what subjects. They would have to do a subject-by-subject examination of the statement.
She said, I never did anything wrong.
That's pretty broad.
Yes, please.
That's a different doctrine. There's something called the exculpatory no doctrine that says you can say that without perjuring yourself.
Do the individual members of Congress have standing to sue to enforce the small business mandate in Obamacare, to force things to a head?
No.
Yes, please.
Would you compare the performance of Attorney General Holder with some other recent attorney generals as far as compliance with the law?
No. I've tried very hard in the time since I've been out of office to avoid getting up and, explicitly skipping rocks off my successor. It's easier some days than others.
General Casey has conducted himself as a gentleman, and you would like to think that people who have been involved in public life would conduct themselves in precisely this manner. Yes,
One
Nick.
would like to think.
As a follow-up and perhaps more general to that very question, how would you rate this administration on the lawlessness scale compared to other administrations?
I don't know of anything, I literally know of nothing to compare with the kind of stuff that's going on here. When you consider not simply what's gone on in the IRS, but across the agencies. The enforcement, the notion of enforcing and not enforcing statutes is something that really snaps your head back. Snaps my head back.
Yes, please.
Since Jonathan Turley recently testified and has come out publicly,
Not one of my favorite people, by the way. To come.
nor perhaps, nevertheless, he is stating that this president is in danger of bringing down the Constitution or bringing down the country and creating an imperialist.
Bring down the Constitution.
That's not going to happen, but creating an imperialist presidency. And he says we're on a dangerous path, which I think is a breath of fresh air coming from that side of the tracks.
Yeah, actually, the danger that I foresee isn't so much that he will create an imperial presidency, because at some point he'll be out of office and somebody else will succeed him, as that he will call into question and cast doubt on and cast shame on the proper exercise of executive authority. That's what really bothers me, because that's where the danger lies. If a president in the future can't exercise authority because he made it smell so bad, then we could be in real danger.
Bill, what are the requirements to impeach the Attorney General?
Same as the requirements to impeach a president or any other federal officer, high crimes and misdemeanors, and it's a political concept. The fact is that the requirements for impeachment are whatever Congress says they are. Congress, that is, the House brings an impeachment charge on whatever basis it chooses to bring an impeachment charge. You don't have to be actually convicted of a crime. You simply have to do something that can be described as a misdemeanor, which is a political concept. It's not a legal concept. It doesn't mean if you get arrested for DUI or something, you're impeachable.
Yes, Dr. Martin.
Is there any legal standing available to the families of those who died in Benghazi to independently or as a group bring suit against the government or members of the government?
No. There is, I'm trying to think of the name of the doctrine, that essentially makes, and that may apply only to the military. I'm actually not certain. Because there is a doctrine that says that soldiers and the families of soldiers cannot, it's called the Ferris Doctrine, F-E-R-E-S, can't sue over injuries that soldiers suffer in the line of duty. Now, whether that would be extended to this situation, I have no idea.
Yes,
Can all of this eventually wind through the courts and to the Supreme Court?
All of which, I'm sorry.
The issues you've discussed?
No, I think that most of what I talked about involves political problems, and the Supreme Court is the last place that I want to see political problems taken. I want to see political problems taken to the electorate.
We exhausted the questions? Let me, number one, thank General McCasey. And hope that we can have an Attorney General like Michael Mukasey in our future. Let me also bring to your attention the fact that we have a number of events sponsored by the London Center that will be coming up, and you'll receive a mailing about all of those, including one interesting one with Jed Babin and yours truly talking about our new book called The Sunni Vanguard. If you are interested in this whole question of the Sunni nations responding to the rapprochement between the United States and Iran, please turn to Amazon, Sunni Vanguard, Jed Babin, Herb London, David Goldman are the authors. Thank you very much for being with us tonight, especially